Hello everyone. So as many of you know, I tend to talk about tarot, artistic process, and why I think visual language matters in tarot and tarot systems. Some of you may remember that I made a Connect the Decks video a few months ago called Bramble's Ancient Manuscripts and the Pagan Otherworlds Tarot. I want this video to be as standalone as possible, but for those who are interested, I think some of the questions I ask in that video will prove relevant to what is covered in this one. It'll be linked in the description at any rate. But basically, I feel so lucky and excited because as a result of making that video, Linnea Gits of uusi reached out to me with an offer to discuss the art and process that went into her deck. She was incredibly accommodating about it as well, because I've been going through various stages of autistic burnout. She very graciously allowed me to interview her via email rather than any kind of, live recorded style format, which is very helpful. So I'll be reading out our correspondence, and I'll also show you various cutaways of the cards and the deck generally, so you guys have a useful sort of visual aid for her answers. Depending on how long this video ends up being, timestamps will be in the description, along with any links mentioned. Also, I'll be doing a follow-up video to this next week, wherein I'll be discussing some of the ramifications of what we cover here. I want to keep this one a bit more straightforward and to the point and informational. And I'll also be discussing in that video things like Celtic mysticism, the idea of other worlds, how we might represent them visually, various art historical connections that I sort of am brainstorming, and also talking about like what I think that means about the resulting system of this deck as a whole. So stay tuned for that if you're interested. Okay. So without further ado, let's get into it. I ended up breaking down my questions for Linnea into sections: art process or technique, and art references. So what I'm going to do is read each question first and then her answer. And as I stated, there will be cutaways kind of showing the deck to kind of help illustrate what this is, sort of what we covered and what this is all about. The Pagan Otherworlds is well known for the quality of paintings it offers to its readers. Can you tell me a bit about the process for creating the deck? How did its conception or aims or themes guide your choice of medium or technique? And Linnea said, as with all our work, traditional mediums become the backbone of the artwork as they lend the imagery emotional energy that computer-generated imagery cannot. We chose oil painting for Pagan Otherworlds because we felt traditional oils would give the imagery a richness and depth that is hard to achieve in other mediums. We also loved the long history of this medium's use in fine art painting and felt it would elevate the work into a powerful space in the imagination. I then asked, for those who are artists or painters themselves, can you tell me a bit about your preferred methods, preliminary sketches, stylistic choices, color palette, brushstrokes, anything like that? And she answered, I think the second most important aspect of our creative process is that our work is made with a particular purpose and use in mind, and almost always has a strict deadline for its completion. We do not have endless time or money to work with, so each step has to be as efficient as possible. We usually begin with a mood board comprised of images and colors that we are inspired by for the particular project we are creating. For Pagan, it was a lot of Renaissance paintings and botanical paintings. There is about a month or two of pushing that imagery, sketches, and ideas around on paper, and the computer working out the style, content, techniques, and rough compositions. Once we feel the work becoming fluid, we move into the final hand-sketched pieces and, as with Pagan, the final oil painting once all is roughed out. One thing to note, a lot of people think that the paintings for this deck are on large canvases, but we never work that way with our decks. We generally work in a 9 by 12 inch format as we create work for a 3 by 5 inch card. And working on this scale allows us to move quickly through paintings and keeps the imagery focused on the essential message it is expressing, We also need to be able to scan all the artwork so we can bring it to the computer to set up the files for print. Large canvases would require a much more expensive and time-consuming documentation process to get the imagery into the computer and ready for print files. In terms of the elements of the process that may or may not have been digitally based, I asked 2 questions. Are there any digital components to the images? Were the cards approached with a layered fashion such as background, foreground, suit elements on top? And then also, in terms of possible digital components, I imagine deck creators must face a lot of repetitive imagery across the tarot system. It seems clear that some kind of digital layering would be useful in keeping the minor arcana cards visually consistent with each other. Are there any particular ways in which you approached this? And Linnea answered as follows. We did not create any of this art digitally, but we do use the computer as a tool to edit, compose, and touch up the paintings in preparation for print files. For Pagan, we started by creating the suit symbols for the deck and a calm blue painted background that would be the canvas for all the cards. This working process allowed us to scan the suit symbols, cut them out in the computer, and then arrange them on the simple painted background. As we moved forward with each painting, we were constantly bringing the artwork to the computer at the very beginning to see how it was reading in its card format. You don't want to get too far down the road on a painting only to discover you should have moved an object lower in the artwork so it doesn't compete with the suit symbols, or that the forms are too heavy and are overwhelming the card. A lot of this process was felt as I worked, but I found that keeping an eye on how it looks in its final card format helps me from overworking a composition and also brings a very effective edit on the overall structure of the piece. Whenever possible, we want a complete painting. Still, there are times when we've had to Photoshop a painting to remove an unnecessary object, or even in the case of the King of Swords, for example, to cut off his hand in the computer and repaint a better gesture. Scan that painting and paste it onto the final painting in the computer. Basically, there are no strict rules on how we work the paintings, as the most important thing is that in the end, the final piece communicates and expresses the essential meaning of the card. And finally, in terms of art process and technique questions, I said, a question for Peter Dunham. What kind of ink and pen did you use for the lettering work? And the answer was, Peter used Japanese ink with Browse pen nibs. So in terms of the art reference section of the questions that I ended up asking, I asked a whole bunch of questions because that's what I'm like. And Linnea kind of gathered them together in sort of one slightly longer answer sort of section. So I'll start this part by just sort of asking, I'll read out the questions that I asked, and that way you'll have kind of all of that helping you to sort of understand what she was addressing in her answer. So I said, the deck has been chosen as an MIT Distinctive Collections acquisition, which is focused on expansive, socially progressive, inclusive decks that innovate the system of tarot, and decks that have pushed the boundaries of the publication industry, such as with the development of crowdfunding decks. I think it's also a prime example of an art-literate deck. Can you tell us a bit about any possible art historical references in the deck? For example, I said, I've mentioned the Vienna Dioscuridies Bramble online before, but I also suspect I see the influence of Ithell Colquhoun in the Two of Cups, for instance. Image will appear on the screen. And so I asked, are there any other moments like this in the deck? I asked, what was that process like for including those? And was this part of your previous approach to art, either personally or through any particular form of education or career work? And on that note, I said that I would link in the description of this video an interview with Card Culture that you can find on their website. But it was really, really interesting, and that takes more of a viewpoint along the lines of playing card decks and some of the techniques and standards and established practices in that regard. And it was really, really interesting. So I was just generally asking, what was that something you were working into the system of the deck more overtly, or was it more of a way of bringing your own innovations into tarot systems and stylistic choices and so on? So those are, loosely speaking, the sort of questions I asked in terms of art reference material, and Linnea answered as follows. The Vienna Dioscuridies Bramble. When I was moving through the artwork on this deck, that work was one of the first inspiration pieces that I pinned on the mood board. It had an incredible feeling of being scientific and incredibly expressive. It was art at its most alchemical. The Pagan Otherworlds artwork started with the major arcana. When I got to the minor arcana, I'd been painting about 6 hours a day for almost 4 months. But when I started the court cards, I suddenly felt the whole deck click into place. To me, the courts define the look and feel of the deck more than the major arcana. The courts are where it all came together and are some of my favorite paintings in the deck. Re-energized by that work, I moved into the pip cards. We had decided to keep people out of the pip cards as we wanted to leave space for nature to shine. We wanted an egoless space that accepted whoever entered it. A place of contemplation that would calm, energize, and clarify in that unique way you experience when entering nature. The Vienna Dioscuridies Bramble just throbs with this kind of energy. It was a touchstone for this deck, and I knew I had to find a place to slip it in. I wanted to bring something old and magical into the work, but my intention was to recreate it, not collage it. So I dropped it into the Ten of Swords composition on the computer as a placeholder and moved on to another composition. However, I was moving so fast at that point through the pip paintings because we had less than a month to complete all the artwork and set it up for print. To make our deadline, I was now working at a speed I was feeling uncomfortable with, and I never did repaint the Vienna Dioscuridies Bramble. It ended up in the deck without my realizing it until the deck was being proofed, and by that point, there was no more time left for painting. It felt a little magical, though, that it had snuck its way in, eager to reincarnate in a modern era inside the spiritual object of a tarot. She then says, I'm unfamiliar with Ithell Colquhoun, but the Two of Cups is another special piece for me in this deck. Many years ago, I read an article in National Geographic about the sandstone arch formation known as the Eye of the Needle. It is located along the Upper Missouri River in South Dakota's Black Hills along Needles Highway and was formed by the water and wind of deep time. From where the photographer shot it, you looked through the eye down what seemed like an endless stretch of river to a setting or rising sun. It appeared that the two stones had pressed their heads together and created this beautiful river dream together. The elements passed through and around them, down the shared river dream that reflected the sky in its pale blue, glass-calm eternity. Enchanted, I cut the photo out of the magazine and placed it in the top corner of our studio mood board. I had no intentions of using it for anything. It just filled me with peace and joy. It was there for over 10 years, and then, one day, it asked to be included in the Pagan Otherworlds Tarot, and it knew exactly where it wanted to be, in the Two of Cups. So thank you so much to Linnea Gits for reaching out to me and allowing me to ask you these questions directly. It was just such an exciting process, so wonderful, and it's given me so much to think about in terms of like ideas for reading the deck now. Thank you also to Peter for answering the question about the calligraphy supplies and technique. Everybody, all of their links, which you may already know anyway, but will be linked in the description, including the card culture interview link. And yeah, so basically there will be the follow-up video, I think probably next week, of me actually discussing a lot of this information and piecing ideas together and coming up with some more things to explore and so on and so forth, systems that I mentioned earlier and things like that. I wanted to keep this video a bit more succinct and informational for those who would like to use it as some kind of a reference point. So my own personal associations and ideas will follow next week. And until then, I hope everyone is well and taking care of themselves to the best of their ability. And I'll see you next time. Bye.